While picking up medication at a gas station Walmart, a retired military man spotted a young girl clinging to a toy beside a man who claimed to be her uncle. But minutes later, as they crossed the parking lot, the girl looked back and gave a subtle, desperate wave. Something in her eyes triggered a memory he couldn't ignore, and in that moment, he knew he had to act before it's too late. The sun burned hot above the sprawl of Santa Fe's largest Walmart supercenter, painting the blacktop of the parking lot with waves of distortion. Frank Halley parked the car in the shade of a creaking mesquite tree, as close as he could manage to the entrance. His knuckles were stiff on the steering wheel. Age and combat had taken their toll, but Frank moved with the quiet intensity of a man who had once led raids in dead zones and jungles alike. Elaine sat beside him, adjusting the brim of her soft cotton hat to shade her eyes. Her arthritis had been worse that morning. Her left hand rested atop her right, swollen joints betraying every season past. "You all right, sweetheart?" Frank asked in a low, gravelly tone. Elaine smiled faintly, not wanting him to worry. "I'll wait here, just need the methotrexate and folic acid, remember?" She reached into her purse with slow, deliberate motion and handed Frank the prescription. He folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll be quick. Lock the doors," he said, scanning the lot out of instinct more than concern. Inside the store, the AC hit him like a blessing. His boots made no sound on the polished tile floors. The store, though busy, had that calm hush of a weekday morning, carts clinking, quiet chatter, the occasional beat from scanners at self-checkout. As he moved through the wide aisles, Frank's mind wandered to the medicine, the groceries, and the usual rotation of daily tasks. He didn't mind errands. They kept his hands and mind busy, useful, purposeful. He turned a corner by the pharmacy and veered off course toward the toy section, intending to circle back. Elaine had mentioned needing batteries for the blood pressure monitor, and they were usually shelved nearby. He passed aisles stacked with plush toys, colorful action figures, and rows of blinking gadgets. That was when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, with shoulder-length blonde hair, stood in front of a shelf of figurines. Her shirt was bright pink with a cartoon bear. She was holding a small box doll, something popular, he guessed, from one of those shows all kids seem to watch. Beside her crouched a man, Hispanic, mid-30s, a 5 o'clock shadow across his tense face. He whispered something to the girl, reaching to take the toy from her hands, but she resisted. Frank slowed his steps, trying not to stare. It was nothing unusual, a kid wanting a toy, a parent saying no, but something in the child's body language struck a wrong note. Her shoulders were drawn in tightly. She didn't speak. Her eyes kept flicking sideways, not toward the toy, but outward, scanning, watching. The girl looked up and saw Frank. Their eyes met. She lifted one hand slowly and gave a small wave. It was gentle, cautious, and held an expression far too aware for someone her age. Frank's heart clenched. The girl's wave, the angle of her fingers, the way she held her hand mid-air, the brief tightness around her mouth, was not just a greeting. It was familiar, hauntingly so, like a ghost from a buried life. 40 years ago, his own daughter, Marin, had waved exactly like that the day before she disappeared from her elementary school in El Paso. Her case had never been solved. The man turned sullenly, catching the girl mid-wave. His hand dropped to her shoulder and gave a subtle, firm squeeze. She lowered her hand at once, glancing at the floor. The man stood, placing the toy back on the shelf. His gaze turned to Frank. Cold, calculating. "Mind your own business, Viejo," he muttered as he ushered the girl toward the end of the aisle. Frank blinked. He hadn't said a word. As they walked away, the man leaned close to the girl again. Frank couldn't hear what he said, but the phrase, "new home," floated back toward him, distorted through the shelves. The girl clutched the hem of her shirt. A tension coiled in Frank's chest, part instinct, part memory. It pressed against his ribs. His first thought, maybe I'm seeing ghosts. But ghosts didn't leave shadows, didn't stare back, didn't wave away with subtle desperation. He shook his head, tried to shake the chill that crept into his spine. Focus. He had a task to finish. Medicine, batteries, out. But the girl's eyes, that wave, they wouldn't let go. As he turned back toward the pharmacy counter, Frank moved slower. He told himself it was age, but he knew better. His mind, trained to scan, was already building profiles. The man's posture, not protective but possessive. The girl's silence, not of a child denied a toy, but of someone used to punishment for speaking out. By the time he handed the pharmacist's wife's prescription, Frank wasn't thinking about the medicine anymore. He was watching. He was remembering. And deep down, a part of him he thought long buried, the soldier, the protector, the father, was waking up again. Frank didn't know what compelled him to follow. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or maybe it was that old instinct, the one honed over decades of service and loss, the one that never quite let go. He didn't pursue them overtly. Instead, he kept a modest distance, navigating the aisles with a cart in front of him, pretending to browse the shelves. But his eyes stayed locked on the man and the little girl. He watched them zigzag past the electronics section, loop around the checkout lanes, and paused at the refrigerated drinks. The girl, he was now sure her name was Samantha, he didn't know how, he just felt it, stared at the floor while the man pulled a juice bottle from the shelf and shoved it into her hands. Frank approached slowly, his hand resting on the handle of his cart. When he was near enough, he gave a gentle nod toward the man and spoke in his most non-threatening voice. "She's a sweet kid. Reminds me of my granddaughter." The man turned his head, eyes narrowing instantly. His jaw tensed, and for a second saw something unfiltered, not annoyance, but calculation. The man took a step closer. "She's not your business, old man," he said, voice low but venomous. "Keep walking." Frank didn't flinch, but he didn't respond either. His hand stayed on the cart. He watched as the man, Victor, he caught the name from the soda bottle label the girl briefly held, grabbed Samantha's arm and pulled her away, not violently but firmly, with a speed that betrayed discomfort. The girl didn't resist, but her shoulders seemed to collapse inward, as though she was folding herself smaller with every step. Frank waited. He stood still as Victor disappeared toward the back of the store, dragging the girl along. His breath came slow. His pulse wasn't racing, not yet, but his chest felt tight. A cold clarity settled into his thoughts. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a grumpy father or a bratty kid. He'd seen those. This was different. Still gripping the cart, Frank turned it toward the pharmacy. A familiar face behind the counter, a middle-aged woman named Diana, greeted him with a smile. "Hey, Mr. Halley, got your wife's prescription right here? Just give me a sec to ring it up." Frank nodded, but said nothing. He looked toward the waiting area where customers picked up orders. Through the glass partition behind Diana, he spotted Victor again, now crouching beside Samantha near the back of the store, near a service entrance. They were speaking, heads bent close. Victor's back was to Frank, but Samantha's face was visible through the reflections. Her mouth wasn't moving. Her eyes darted to the door. She looked like a bird watching a cage close. Frank leaned slightly, as if inspecting something on the counter, but kept his gaze fixed. The microphone of the pharmacy intercom crackled, distracting Diana momentarily. In that instant, Frank saw Victor lean in and whisper something directly into Samantha's ear. Her face tightened. Then she nodded once, barely perceptible. Victor stood again, brushing off his jeans, and said something else, louder this time. Though faint through the glass, Frank caught the words. "Don't make a scene. We're going to your new home." New home. The phrase struck Frank harder than it should have. It wasn't what you said to a child during a casual day out. It wasn't the way you phrased moving to a new apartment or visiting relatives. Not with that tone. It was coercion cloaked in promise. Frank had heard it before. In South America, in Eastern Europe, from mouths of men who traded in false hope. He realized Diana had been talking to him. "Mr. Halley? Sorry, system dagged. Got your methotrexate and folic acid here. Anything else you need?" Frank blinked, forcing himself back into the moment. He shook his head. "No, that's all. Thanks, Deanna." She placed the bags in front of him. "Take care of Mrs. Halley, all right? She called ahead, told me her joints were flaring bad today." Frank forced a smile, nodded again, and slid his card through the reader. He took the small white bag, tucked it under his arm, and pushed the cart slowly away. But his mind wasn't on Elaine anymore. It was on Samantha. And Victor. He didn't head for the groceries. Instead, he made a quiet loop back toward the aisle where he'd first seen them. They weren't there. He pivoted, then moved past the self-checkout lanes. Still no sign. He was beginning to think they'd left when he caught a flash of pink, Samantha's shirt, disappearing behind a pillar near the garden center exit. Frank picked up his pace. Quietly, no sudden movements. He left the cart near the return desk, no longer pretending to shop. At the end of the aisle, he saw them again. Victor had Samantha by the wrist, not tight, but firm. She wasn't resisting, but she wasn't looking at him either. Her gaze was fixed ahead, blank, distant, as if she wasn't entirely there. Frank stepped forward. Victor turned. His expression didn't change. No surprise. "I told you," he said flatly, stepping slightly between Frank and the girl. "Mind your business." Frank stared back, calmly, steady. Victor tilted his head. "What is this, huh? You think you're saving someone? You think you're some kind of hero?" Frank didn't reply. He looked at Samantha. Just looked. Her eyes flicked to him for the briefest second. Her lips parted as if to say something, then closed again. Her fingers twitched. Victor pulled her closer. "Come on," he said, turning away. Frank stood there, fists clenched at his sides, pulse finally rising. He knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard, but without proof, without context, he was just another old man chasing shadows in a superstore. He watched them disappear again. He needed a plan. He needed time, and something inside him, some ancient, burning instinct, told him that time was running out. Frank returned to the car with the medicine bag tucked under one arm, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. As he opened the driver's side door, Elaine glanced up from behind her sunglasses. Her expression immediately shifted. "You're late," she said quietly, "and you're sweating more than usual." Frank handed her the bag without a word. She narrowed her eyes at him. "Frank?" He didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen to reveal the photo he'd snapped earlier, the one of Samantha in the toy aisle. The image was slightly blurred, taken in haste, but the girl's face was unmistakable. There was tension in her expression, not of tantrum or disappointment, but something older, darker. Elaine took the phone and squinted at it. "Who's this?" "The girl from inside," Frank muttered. "The one with the man who didn't want company." Elaine studied the image, her fingers enlarging it cautiously. "This isn't just a photo, is it?" she asked, her voice shifting to something quieter. Frank shook his head. "I think something's wrong, real wrong." Elaine tilted the phone slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What's that on her arm?" "Where?" "Here," she said, pointing with her fingernail just beneath the sleeve of the girl's pink shirt. "There's a mark. See it? Right here, barely visible, but it's there." Frank leaned closer, eyes focusing. It looked like a faint bruise or maybe a needle prick, circular, with a subtle bluish halo. "Could be from a shot," he said. Elaine looked up sharply. "No. That's too precise. That's not a vaccination mark. That's recent, and it's not from a nurse. That's what we used to see in the clinic, sedation points, used for kids who needed to be calmed during seizure episodes." Or her voice trailed off. Frank met her gaze. "Or what?" she hesitated. "Or in darker cases." A long silence filled the car, broken only by the steady thrum of distant traffic and the slow churn of the AC. Frank exhaled and turned to open the door again. Elaine gripped his arm. "You're not going back in there without telling me what you're planning." "I'm not planning anything yet," he said. "But I need to know more. There's something else, something I missed." Elaine didn't stop him as he stepped back out and walked briskly across the hot asphalt toward the entrance. Inside, the store was unchanged, bright, clean, falsely cheerful. The toy aisle wasn't hard to find again. Frank moved past rows of boxed dolls, LED light plastic swords, and novelty items until he reached the same section where he'd first seen Samantha, the same shelf, the same figurines. He paused, scanning the space. The crowd was light, no one in immediate proximity. Then he saw it, one of the figurine boxes, tilted askew on the shelf, upside down, different from the neatly arranged others. It was the one Samantha had been holding. He recognized the character on the front, a little creature with wide eyes and sparkling wings. Frank reached for the box. As he lifted it, a slip of paper fell from underneath it, drifting toward the linoleum floor like a whisper. He bent and picked it up. It was no larger than a gum wrapper, creased in half, slightly smudged. A child's handwriting, shaky, in blue ink. One word, Help. Frank's breath caught. He stared at the paper, the word etched deep into his vision. It wasn't elaborate, there were no names, no locations, no drama, just the raw desperation of a single word. His pulse quickened, fingers tightening around the note. He turned the figurine over, inspecting the plastic packaging. Nothing unusual, but the placement, deliberate, not accidental. This had been hidden, folded and wedged beneath, and only someone who had held it, inspected it, would have dislodged it. Someone like Samantha. Frank placed the figurine back exactly where it had been, the better to leave no signs of tampering. He slipped the note into his pocket, heart pounding louder now. He moved to the edge of the aisle and looked both ways. Still no sign of Victor, no sign of Samantha. He backtracked toward the electronics section, then detoured into seasonal goods. He passed the garden center, scanned the checkout lanes again. Nothing. Either they had left the building or they were lying in wait somewhere less visible. Returning to the main aisle, Frank walked with practiced calm. His mind, however, was anything but calm. Everything was screaming now, the girl's eyes, the way she folded inwards, the grip on her arm. And now the note. A word not written in boredom or mischief, but in desperation. A cry stashed under a toy like a message in a bottle. He pressed his hand against his chest, not because of pain, but to still the beating. Elaine was right. This wasn't random. He needed to know who they were, and he needed to know fast. Frank circled toward customer service, spotted the security podium near the front entrance. 2 young associates stood behind it, one bored and scrolling on a tablet, the other eating something from a plastic container. He approached slowly. "Excuse me," he said, voice polite but firm. The girl with the tablet looked up. "Yes, sir?" "I don't mean to cause alarm," Frank began, "but I think I just saw a child in trouble. I'd like to know if your cameras cover the toy section and the checkout lanes." The girl blinked, chewing her gum. Well, I'm not allowed to access that. We'd have to call a manager." Frank nodded. "Then call one, please." His tone was unmistakable now, calm but commanding. The girl hesitated, then tapped her radio. Martin DeFront, guest needs assistance at the podium." Frank waited, resisting the urge to pace. He glanced toward the exit, then to the back of the store. The silence around him buzzed. He needed more. Not just gut feelings, not just subtle signs. He needed confirmation, a plate number, a name, a trail. Something that made it real enough for someone else to see. As the manager approached, Frank felt the paper in his pocket, the little word burning like a brand. As the manager walked off, clearly unconvinced by Frank's polite but firm insistence, Frank knew time was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't rely on store policy or indifferent employees. He had seen too much. The faint mark on Samantha's arm, the word "help" scribbled and hidden in a toy box, and the fear cloaked behind those wide, desperate eyes. This wasn't something to be explained away or shrug off. He moved swiftly but inspicaciously toward the checkout lanes, retracing the last area where he'd glimpsed them earlier. The front of the store was more crowded now, with customers lining up, carts clattering, and the buzz of scanning items filling the air. Frank's eyes swept over each register. Then he saw them. 3 lanes over, Victor stood hunched at a self-checkout machine, swiping a bottle of juice and a plastic-wrapped sandwich. Samantha stood to his left, holding a small snack pack in one hand. Her other hand rested at her side. She looked pale, still, unreadable. Victor was focused on the touchscreen, jabbing his finger at the payment options, his lips moving in irritated whispers. For a few seconds, his attention was entirely elsewhere. That's when Samantha looked up and saw Frank. Their eyes met again, just like before in the toy aisle, but this time there was no smile, no wave. She lifted her right hand slowly, turning her palm outward, then curled her index and middle fingers down and up again in a flicking motion. Once, twice. It was subtle, barely noticeable, like a nervous tick, but Frank recognized it instantly. He had seen that motion during a school seminar last year when his neighbor's granddaughter had performed it during a self-defense class. It was the child distress signal, now taught in schools and safety campaigns across the country. A nonverbal way to say, "I'm not okay. I need help." The muscles in Frank's shoulders locked. Samantha dropped her hand as Victor turned slightly, but she didn't look away. Not until Frank gave the faintest of nods. He acted quickly. The toy she'd held earlier, the figurine with the sparkly wings, was still fresh in his memory. He doubled back to the aisle, moving with purpose but without drawing attention. The box was where he'd left it, perfectly arranged among the rest. Frank snatched it, turned on his heel, and headed for the nearest express lane. The line was short. Within a minute, he was swiping his card, ignoring the cashier's small talk, and bagging the item himself. He kept the receipt and tucked the toy gently into his canvas shoulder bag. It wasn't just a gesture now. It was a connection. Something to link her to him in case everything went wrong. Frank didn't return to the car. Not yet. He walked quickly toward the exit, scanning for Victor and Samantha. They were just ahead, pushing through the sliding glass doors, blending into the steady stream of shoppers coming and going. Victor walked fast, his stride long and impatient. Samantha struggled to keep up. The snack pack dangled from her hand. She looked exhausted. As Frank stepped out into the bright Santa Fe sun, the heat rushed at him in waves, dry and suffocating. The parking lot was busy, but not chaotic. He kept his distance, weaving between cars, staying at least 5 vehicles behind them. He didn't want Victor to know he was being followed. From his angle, he could see Victor click his key fob, prompting a distant SUV's lights to blink once. It was a dark gray Chevy parked near the far end of the lot. Frank slowed slightly and kept to the shade cast by the taller vehicles. He stayed in motion, feigning interest in other cars, occasionally pulling out his phone to make it look like he was checking directions. But all the while, his eyes were locked on the girl. She hesitated as they reached the vehicle. Victor opened the rear door and motioned for her to climb in. She paused, just for a beat, her eyes turning back, not toward Frank this time, but toward the store. He wondered if she was hoping someone else might be watching, that another adult, another stranger, might notice something off. Victor barked something under his breath and grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the back seat with more force than necessary. Frank's jaw clenched. He moved closer now, crouching beside a sedan, pretending to tie his shoe. He noted the license plate, New Mexico tags partially covered in dust, but legible, 7YTM28. He mouthed the letters and numbers 3 times to memorize them. Victor slammed the door shut and walked to the driver's side, tossing the bag of snacks into the front seat. Before climbing in, he scanned the parking lot, his eyes cutting through the midday haze. Frank ducked slightly behind the sedan, waiting. When the car engine turned over and the vehicle began to reverse, Frank moved again, casually walking toward his own car 2 rows over, never looking directly at Victor. He reached the passenger side and opened the door as if he were preparing to leave. But he didn't get in. Instead, he glanced inside at Elaine, who had fallen into a light nap, head tilted against the seat, her hand still resting on the medicine bag. Frank closed the door gently so as not to wake her, then turned back toward the lot. Victor's SUV was pulling out now, slowly making its way toward the main exit road. Frank started walking, not too fast, not too slow. He stayed on the side longer to the lane to watch the walk slowly assess. As Victor's vehicle turned right at the edge of the property, Frank quickened his pace. He would follow on foot only to the edge. Then he'd make a choice. He just needed one more look at the direction they were heading. Frank rounded the last row of parked cars just as Victor's SUV eased to a stop near the far exit of the lot. There were fewer vehicles on this end, less cover, less noise. He slowed, stepping behind a weathered Ford pickup and crouching slightly to stay out of view. From his position, he could see the vehicle clearly. Victor stood at the rear passenger door, open wide. Samantha remained on the pavement, her little body stiff as a board, her arms pulled in tightly. She wasn't crying, not that Frank could see, but there was resistance in every fiber of her posture. She wasn't going willingly. Victor's hand clamped down on her upper arm. She twisted, not dramatically, but enough to show her discomfort. He leaned down, speaking to her through clenched teeth. Frank couldn't hear the words, but he saw the tightening of Victor's jaw, the hard jerk of his wrist. That's when Victor reached down, his free hand sliding around her back and yanking her upward in one motion. She didn't scream, she didn't kick, but her legs went rigid and she pushed against him weakly, palms flat against his chest. Frank's heart pounded. This wasn't discipline, this wasn't parenting, this was forced compliance. Frank didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing 911. As the first ring sounded in his ear, he stepped into the sunlight, keeping his distance but raising his voice slightly, aiming for calm urgency. "Come on, girl," Victor muttered, hoisting Samantha into the seat and buckling her in, clearly aware of the visibility around him now. "Don't start again. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm female voice answered. Frank stepped backward, turning his body sideways to shield the call from view. "My name is Frank Halley," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm at the Walmart Supercenter in Santa Fe. I just witnessed what looks like a possible abduction. A man is forcing a young girl into an SUV. "Can you describe the man in the vehicle?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," Frank said quickly. "Hispanic male, mid-30s, dark hair, 5 o'clock shadow. The girl is white, blonde hair, around 6 or 7, wearing a pink shirt. The SUV is a dark gray Chevy, license plate 7, Yellow Tango Mike 28. "He's parked near the child's scream or call for help?" the dispatcher asked, voice sharpening slightly. "No," Frank admitted, jaw tightening, but she clearly resisted. He grabbed her forcefully. "I've seen things like this before." She waved at me inside. "Did a child distress signal?" There was a note, written help, hidden in a toy she touched. There was a pause. "Sir, I understand your concern," the dispatcher replied cautiously. "But without direct signs of distress or a missing person report, it's difficult to treat this as a confirmed abduction. Are you able to follow the vehicle safely?" Frank hesitated, watching the SUV's brake lights flare as Victor pulled into the exit lane. "Possibly," he said, "but I need to make sure my wife is safe first. She's still in our car." "Understood. Officers will be dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line if you decide to follow, but do not engage with the suspect," the dispatcher instructed firmly. Just then, Frank's phone vibrated against his cheek. Another call was coming in, Elaine. He cursed under his car. She was still in the same spot. He quickly tapped over to the incoming call. "Taylor," and he answered, voice low. "Frank," Elaine's voice cut in, tight with panic. "Where are you? I've been sitting here for almost 30 minutes. You said you were just going in to get the medicine." "I know," Frank said, breath tight. "I have it. I've just—" "No, you don't," she said sharply. "I called the pharmacy. They said your name was never checked in. No pickup recorded." Frank closed his eyes for a beat. Of course, he'd never actually given his name. He'd paid in a rush, forgotten the protocol. "I got distracted," he said. "Elaine, I think there's a child in danger. I saw something, someone, a man, he's taking a girl. It doesn't look right." Elaine was quiet for a second, then exhaled hard. "Frank, you left me sitting here in this heat, thinking something happened to you. My joints are locking up. I've been watching people walk in and out, and none of them were you." "I'm sorry," Frank said, meaning it. "I didn't plan this, but I couldn't just walk away either. You should go home. I'll take care of this." "No," Elaine said immediately. "You're not doing this alone. I don't care if I can't run anymore. If you're right about that little girl, you need backup. I'm not leaving you." Frank turned his eyes toward the exit. The SUV had just made a right turn onto the main road. He wasn't going to make it on foot, not in time. He needed to think fast. "I'll come to the car," he said quickly. "Stay put. I'll explain everything when I get there." He hung up without waiting for a reply, jogged across the lot, and jumped into the driver's seat. Elaine was already pulling herself upright, her concern shifting to focus. Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel, tires humming against the pavement as they sped toward the highway exit. Elaine sat quietly beside him, her hands resting on her lap, still and calm, but her eyes never leaving the road. She hadn't pressed for details. She hadn't needed to. Her husband's urgency, his posture, the clipped tone of his voice when he said, "We're following a kidnapper," had told her everything she needed to know. When they had first met, decades ago, Frank was already the kind of man who saw things others missed. The flick of a lie in someone's eyes, the shift of a hand before it reached for a weapon, the pause in silence just before something terrible unfolded. He wasn't prone to panic, and when he told her across the border, Elaine had simply nodded, reached across the seat, and taken his hand. "If she's the only child we saved today," she had said, her voice steady, "then it's still worth it." That was Elaine. Arthritis in her bones, pain in her joints, but a spine made of iron. The GPS tracker on Frank's phone still had their last sighting marked, the exit onto a lesser-used stretch of road southbound. Frank merged quickly, scanning traffic ahead. "He's not going to a neighborhood," he muttered. "He's not even heading toward a shopping center." Elaine didn't speak. She leaned forward slightly, searching for a flash of gray in the sunlight. The landscape began to change, commercial buildings giving way to long stretches of dirt and scrubland, a few roadside signs rusting in the heat. "We're heading toward the border," Frank said aloud. "If he makes it there, we'll lose him." They rounded a bend and passed a small hardware supply store. Just beyond it stood a rundown gas station, 2 pumps, faded signage, a tiny attached store with dusty windows and a crooked open sign. Frank's eyes narrowed. Parked at the far end, under the shade of a warped metal awning, was the gray SUV. He eased into a spot 2 rows behind it, hidden behind a larger pickup truck. Elaine turned toward him, her voice low and urgent. "She's still inside?" Frank squinted. Through the tinted back window, he could just make out a figure slumped in the passenger side. A child. "Looks like it," he said. "He left her in there. Alone." He went inside. "With her locked in? That's what I need to find out." Frank shifted in his seat. His old instincts coiled tight beneath the surface. This gas station, so close to the Mexican border, wasn't just a rest stop. It could be a transfer point, a meeting place, or worse. Elaine reached into the paper bag and pulled out the medication he had meant to give her hours ago. She opened the bottle, popped 2 pills into her palm, and swallowed them dry. Then she adjusted her sunglasses, pulled her seat upright, and said, "Let's stay calm, but if she's unconscious in there, we're not waiting for backup." Frank glanced at her, his throat thick with admiration. "You okay to hold the car down?" "Just like we used to," she said, nodding once. "You go. Don't start a fight unless you have to." Frank got out slowly, keeping the car between him and the SUV. The air outside was heavy, the scent of gasoline and dry dust clinging to every breath. He walked around the back of the truck, stopping at the edge of the gas station building to keep in partial shadow. From there he had a clear line of sight into the gray SUV. The back seat was empty, but the passenger seat held Samantha, her body limp, slumped sideways, with her cheek resting on the window. Her pink shirt was bunched, her arms tucked against her body. She wasn't moving. Panic sparked in Frank's chest, white-hot and immediate. He stepped closer. That's when he saw it, through the front windshield, lying on the console between the front seats, was a small bottle. A cough syrup label, familiar from his years as a father. He couldn't make out the brand, but the cap was off. The bottle tilted slightly, almost empty. Drugged, she'd been sedated. Whatever pretense Victor had maintained was over now. He didn't wait. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 for the second time that day. "This is Frank Halley," he said as soon as the dispatcher answered. "I'm at a gas station about 6 minutes south of Walmart Santa Fe. There's a child in a gray SUV, passenger's seat. She's unconscious. I believe she's been kidnapped and drugged." "Are you in danger, sir?" "No," Frank lied smoothly, "but the suspect went into the convenience store. He could come back any second. I need officers here, now. Border Patrol if possible." "We're dispatching units immediately. Do not engage," the dispatcher emphasized. "Stay on the line." "I can't," Frank said. "He's coming." He hung up before she could respond. From inside the store, the glass doors swung open. Victor stepped out, a plastic bag in one hand. He looked over his shoulder, clearly checking the surroundings. His gaze swept the lot, passing over Frank's position once without stopping. In the bag, Frank caught sight of duct tape, wet wipes, and a small, unopened burner phone box. His stomach turned. It was real. This wasn't just trafficking, it was transformation. Or is sure. Victor planned to disappear with Samantha, and he was seconds away from getting back in that vehicle. Frank moved again, faster now, stepping out into the sunlit open with his heart thundering. Frank moved with quiet but deliberate urgency, his footsteps crunching softly against the sun-baked gravel as he crossed the narrow lot between the gas station and Victor's SUV. The temperature had climbed into the high 90s, and the sunlight bounced off the vehicle's metal surfaces like a furnace blast, but none of that registered. His focus had narrowed to a single target, the passenger window where Samantha lay. As he approached, he adjusted his body angle to minimize reflections and peered inside. The sight stopped his breath short. Samantha was slumped over the passenger seat, her head tilted unnaturally against the glass. One arm dangled lifelessly, her small fingers curled into a soft fist, resting on the console. Her face was pale, almost waxy in the light, and her lips, parted slightly, barely moved with each breath. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, almost imperceptibly. A jolt of panic rushed through Frank. He scanned the interior again and spotted the open bottle wedged between the cup holders, tilted at an awkward angle. The label had peeled slightly, revealing the words, "Children's Nighttime Cough Syrup." It wasn't the usual over-the-counter variety. This one had a warning printed in red ink and a dosage chart that indicated strict age and weight limitations. The cap was missing. The liquid inside was low. Frank reached instinctively for the door handle, testing it. Locked. Of course. Victor wasn't stupid, but he hadn't expected anyone to follow. He glanced toward the entrance of the store. Victor was inside, unaware. Frank circled the front of the SUV, scanning for a way to buy time or force access. The heat rising from the pavement distorted his vision for a moment, the shimmer of air blending into the grille of the vehicle. His mind clicked through scenarios, busting a window, tipping Victor off too soon. But he didn't get the chance to choose. The door to the gas station swung open. Victor stepped out, the plastic bag swinging from his hand. Frank's eyes locked onto the items inside. A roll of gray duct tape, a pack of wet wipes, and a prepaid flip phone still in its packaging. Every part of Frank's training screamed the same conclusion: preparation for disappearance, clean up, communication with no trace, control. His chest tightened, and his feet moved on their own, stepping forward into the direct path between Victor and the vehicle. Victor saw him immediately. The lazy grin he'd worn earlier vanished, replaced by something flat and dangerous. He stopped mid-step, his free hand closing into a fist at his side. "You again?" he growled. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone came out low, steady, and unmovable. "You're not taking her anywhere." Victor's eyes flicked past Frank to the SUV, then back. His nostrils flared. "You following me now, old man? You're stalking us." "I called the police," Frank said evenly. "They're on their way." Victor scoffed, taking another step forward. "You think I care? You don't know anything. She's my niece. She's tired. That's all." "She's drugged," Frank snapped. "I saw the bottle. I saw the way she waved at me in that store. You've been treating her like cargo. She's not your niece." Victor dropped the bag. It hit the ground with a sharp plastic crunch. "Get out of my way," he growled, stepping in closer. The muscles in his arms tensed, his posture coiling like a spring. "I'm not going to tell you again." Frank stood firm, feet shoulder-width apart, arms at his sides. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. "If you want to get to that car," Frank said quietly, "you'll have to go through me." Victor's lips curled into a sneer. Big words for someone who's about to eat pavement. Frank didn't flinch. His mind was running years ahead of this moment, training fields, deployment zones, unspoken threats faced and diffused. His body didn't move, but everything in him was ready. He didn't need to win a fight. He just needed to delay long enough. Every second mattered. Victor lunged out of feint, full force, one arm swinging out while the other reached toward his belt. Frank stepped sideways, pivoting with the movement, catching Victor's wrist mid-air. The momentum sent both of them into a brief struggle, their feet scraping against the ground. Victor's free hand grabbed for Frank's shirt, but Frank twisted, breaking his palm into the younger man's chest and pushing him back 2 steps. Victor stumbled, cursed loudly, and then froze, eyes darting past Frank toward the edge of the lot. In the distance, the faint whine of sirens echoed through the still desert air, slowly growing louder. Frank didn't move, chest heaving from the burst of adrenaline. "It's over," he said simply. Victor's eyes narrowed, his breathing quickened. Then, suddenly, he reached into his pocket. Victor's hand darted into his pocket with terrifying speed, and Frank's instincts kicked in before his thoughts could catch up. He shifted his stance just as the glint of a blade caught the sunlight. A folding knife, simple but sharp, flashing silver against the hot, dry New Mexico air. The younger man lunged, growling, his momentum fueled by panic and rage. Frank stepped sideways, turning his shoulders to avoid the direct line of the blade. Time slowed for a moment, and all sound seemed to disappear except for the pounding of Frank's own heartbeat. The years fell away. He wasn't in a gas station parking lot anymore. He was back in the concrete alleys of Mogadishu, in the echoing corridors of abandoned warehouses overseas, in all the places where hesitation meant death. The knife came in low, aiming for his ribs, but Frank twisted his torso and deflected the strike with his forearm. Pain lanced through his wrist, but he didn't let it break his focus. He stepped into the attack, not away from it, closing the distance and grabbing Victor's knife-wielding arm at the wrist. The blade hovered inches from his side, trembling under the pressure of their locked muscles. With his free hand, Frank struck the pressure point below Victor's shoulder with the heel of his palm, a move drilled into him during combat training. Victor grunted in pain, the knife falling from his grip and clattering to the pavement. Frank didn't let go. He pivoted behind Victor in one fluid motion, trapping the younger man's arm and sweeping one leg behind his opponent's knee. With a sharp downward force, he drove Victor to the ground, pinning him chest first against the scorching asphalt. Gravel bit into Frank's own knees, but he didn't care. He pressed Victor's wrist to the pavement with all the strength he could muster, using his body weight to keep him down. Victor writhed beneath him, cursing in both English and Spanish, but his strength couldn't match the fury of a man who had spent decades fighting both abroad and within himself. And then sirens. Louder now, closer. A second later, the screech of tires, doors flying open, shouted commands. Frank stayed where he was, both hands firmly locking Victor down. "Knife's on the ground," he called out. "He attacked first." They flipped the man over, cuffed him roughly, and began shouting questions. Name, intent, where's the child? Victor refused to answer, his jaw clenched, eyes darting toward the SUV. A third officer rushed to the vehicle, unlocking it with keys taken from Victor's pocket, opening the door and gently checking Samantha's pulse. "She's alive," the officer called out, "weak, but breathing." Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Sir, are you injured?" another officer asked, stepping toward him. "I'm fine," Frank replied hoarsely, his voice raw from adrenaline. "Just old and pissed off." "Parameters are en route," the officer assured him, "but we need your statement ASAP." Frank nodded, watching as more units pulled into the lot. One officer began searching Victor's pockets. Out came a weathered wallet, thick, suspiciously so. The officer opened it, then glanced at his partner. "We've got multiple ideas here," he muttered. "Different names, different states. Let me see." His partner took the wallet, flipping through it quickly. Juan Ramirez, Miguel Sanchez, Carlos Ortiz, none matched the name on the vehicle registration. "This guy's got at least 3 identities." "Traffic?" one of them asked. "Almost definitely," the lead officer responded grimly. Frank stepped closer. "Check the bag he brought out from the store. There's a prepaid burner phone in there. Duct tape, wet wipes. That wasn't a snack run." The officers didn't question him. One nodded and retrieved the bag, confirming the contents. Another officer joined them, holding a thin, dog-eared notepad that had been stuffed into Victor's back pocket. "Sir," the officer said, flipping it open, "you'll want to hear this." He handed it to the lead officer, who scanned the pages. His face changed instantly, hardening, the lines around his mouth tightening. "Names," he said. "Dozens of them, all first names, girls. Ages listed, some have check marks, others have locations next to them. New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada." Frank felt cold. He stepped forward, barely breathing. "Let me see." The officer hesitated, then tilted the notepad toward him. Frank's eyes scanned the list. It was handwritten, blocky and crude, but one name leapt out at him. Samantha. Age 6, Santa Fe. Check. The scene around the gas station was controlled chaos. Red and blue lights flashing, radios squawking with updates, officers coordinating off the area with yellow tape, while the ambulance pulled up to the curb with a shrill cry of urgency. Frank stood nearby, sweat dripping down the side of his temple, despite the shade of a now useless canopy overhead. His shirt clung to his back, dusty and wrinkled, his hand still trembling slightly as he recounted every detail to a uniformed officer with a notepad. Across the lot, paramedics had gently lifted Samantha from the SUV and laid her onto a stretcher with precise, practiced movements. She remained still, her limbs slack, her face ghostly pale. An oxygen mask covered her mouth, and a drip line was being prepped by the second EM. Frank's eyes never left her. He'd never known what fear could truly feel like until that moment, watching a child who'd called out for help in the only ways she could, now lying unconscious from whatever poison Victor had used to keep her compliant. One of the paramedics, a woman with auburn hair tied tightly behind her head, called over her shoulder, "Pulse is weak but stable. She's responding to stimuli. Pupils are dilating evenly." Frank stepped forward, but an officer gently held him back. "We need space here, sir." Frank began, then stopped. He didn't know what he needed, only that he couldn't let her disappear again. The officer, seeing the struggle in Frank's eyes, softened. "We'll let you talk to her once she's stable. You did a hell of a thing today." Frank nodded absently, his gaze fixed on the child. Minutes stretched. The paramedics continued monitoring her, moving swiftly and quietly, until one of them stretched slightly. "Shut his eyes coming," he said. "Eyes fluttering. Let's lower the mask a bit." Frank moved closer, barely registering that Elaine had now stepped out of the car and was quietly approaching, her steps slow but determined. She placed a hand on his back, grounding him. "She's waking up," Frank whispered. Samantha stirred, her fingers twitching slightly as the medic adjusted the oxygen mask. Her lips moved. No sound came at first, then a faint, breathy murmur escaped. "Where?" "You're safe, sweetheart," the medic said gently. "You're safe now." Samantha blinked, her gaze unfocused, roaming across unfamiliar faces until it landed on Frank. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened not with fear, but recognition. "You gave me the toy." Frank stepped closer, his throat catching. "Yes," he said softly. "You remembered." She gave the faintest nod, her chin barely lifting off the stretcher. "Like saw you. In the store. I was scared." "I know," he said, swallowing hard. "I'm so glad you're safe now." Tears welled in Elaine's eyes as she clutched Frank's arm, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then, from the other side of the parking lot, came the squeal of tires and the slam of a car door. A voice pierced the heavy air, desperate and rising. "Emma? Emma? Where's my daughter?" Frank turned. A woman was running, sprinting, really, across the lot, hair wild, eyes wide, a man chasing just behind her. She wore a loose blouse soaked in sweat, and her shoes slapped against the pavement with frantic urgency. Two officers intercepted her, but she shoved past them, screaming again. "Emma! Please! Emma!" The sound of that name, Emma, hung in the air like a jolt of electricity. Frank's heart stopped. "Yar. Emma?" The woman reached the edge of the crowd, her eyes landing on the stretcher just as Samantha turned her head toward the noise. "Mom?" Samantha croaked, confused. The woman gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Emma," she sobbed. "My God! Emma!" The officers pulled back, realizing instantly who she was. One of the detectives stepped in to intercept, but waved her through as the woman stumbled forward, and waved her through as the woman stumbled forward, and waved her through as the stretcher. She reached for her daughter's hand, kissing it over and over, her tears falling onto the girl's fingers. "It's me, baby. It's Mommy. I found you." Samantha, Emma, blinked slowly, her mouth trying to form words. I thought I'd never see you again." "I'm here," the woman whispered. "You're safe. I've been looking everywhere. Since the fire, we thought, they told us." She broke off, sobbing uncontrollably. Frank stepped back, giving them space, his mind reeling. The fire? Another officer approached the scene quietly and spoke to the detective, handing him a file. "Her name's Emma Parker," the officer murmured. "Reported missing 11 months ago during that forest fire near Los Alamos. Whole campsite went up, parents were rescued, but the daughter was never found." "Presumed dead." Frank's mouth opened slightly, stunned. Elaine stepped closer, her hand in his. "She was lost to the world," Elan said, softly shaking heads at his softly. "She was lost to the world. Until today," Frank murmured. The late afternoon sun bathed a gas station in a golden haze as paramedics finished stabilizing Emma for transport. Officers had moved Victor into the back of a squad car, wrists bound tight behind him, his face bruised, jaw clenched in bitter defeat. The evidence collected, IDs, the notepad, the burner phone, the medication bottle, was now secured in plastic bags inside a second cruiser. A detective stood nearby, taking statements from Emma's mother, while another officer conferred with Frank and Elaine. Emma, no longer unconscious but still groggy, sat upright on the stretcher, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a gentle IV line taped to her arm. Her mother hadn't let go of her hand for a second. Frank stood a few feet away, watching quietly, unwilling to intrude on a reunion so sacred. But then Emma looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found his. She said something to her mother, who nodded gently and stepped aside. The little girl slid off the stretcher slowly, her knees wobbly but her steps sure, and walked straight toward Frank. Elaine stepped back as Emma reached up and wrapped her small arms around his waist, burying her face into his jacket. Frank's breath caught in his chest. Slowly, he knelt down to meet her eye to eye. She looked at him, her gaze clearer now, filled with something deeper than gratitude. "You're my hero," she said softly, her voice still hoarse. "If you hadn't come, if you didn't follow me, I wouldn't be Emma anymore." Frank's throat tightened, but he managed to smile. "You were always Emma," he whispered. "You never stopped being her." She hugged him again, tighter this time. "I'm going to put the toy you gave me on my backpack, so I remember, always." Frank nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "That sounds perfect." A tear slid down his face before he could stop it. Emma pulled away, smiled, and then returned to her mother's embrace. The woman looked over at Frank and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." He gave a small nod, heart full. As the ambulance doors closed and the lights flicked on in silent readiness, the last echoes of chaos began to fade. Officers wrapped up the final reports. A detective approached Frank with a handshake and a look of real respect. "You didn't just stop a kidnapping," the man said. "You exposed a trafficking ring. That list he had, some of those names match open cases across 3 states. We'll be making more arrests thanks to this." Frank shook his hand but said nothing. He didn't need validation. He didn't need a medal. The only thing he needed was standing right in front of him, safe, alive, reunited. He turned to Elaine, who was wiping her eyes beneath her sunglasses, trying to look composed. "You were right," he said gently. "About what?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Frank looked out at the sky, now painted in hues of orange and lavender as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon. "I used to think we'd done our part, that people our age were supposed to rest, take our hands off the wheel and let the younger generation take it from here." He turned back to her, his voice low but resolute. "But today reminded me, we still have work to do. We still have something to give. Even without the uniform." Elaine smiled through her tears, reaching for his hand. "You never really stopped serving, Frank. You just needed the right mission." He kissed the back of her hand, softly, then held it against his chest. As they walked slowly back to their car, the noise of the scene faded into the background. The ambulance pulled away, followed by the cruiser carrying Victor in the opposite direction. A breeze picked up, warm and dry, carrying the faint scent of gasoline and hope. Frank opened the passenger door for Elaine, helped her in gently, then circled to the driver's side. Before getting in, he took one last look at the now quiet lot. It looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, and yet in this very place a life had been saved. A family had been restored, a truth had been revealed. He took a deep breath, steady and strong. There was still time left to do good. Still time to answer when the world whispered for help. Still time to be the kind of man a little girl would call her hero. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more true story-inspired mysteries. What do you think about Frank's decision to act? Would you have done the same? And which moment hit you the hardest? Let us know in the comments. Also, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel.